Welcome and thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities' first Lunch and Learn program of 2024. We are gearing up for another great year of thought-provoking programs that include new research, new perspectives, and speakers that will challenge your assumptions. I'm so glad to have you all with us here as we kick off the new year. I'm Ilana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Chief Operating Officer. We have people joining us today from all over. Please take a moment and let us know where you are tuning in from in the chat. In just 3 weeks, we have an in-person program that you don't want to miss. In commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we are going to be bringing together Maud and Ingrid in person. In 1942, Maud was 6 years old, living in the Netherlands. The Nazi presence was becoming increasingly dangerous for Jewish families like Maud's. When Maud's family received a call-up notice instructing them to come to the train station with a suitcase, the family was suspicious. They called upon a non-Jewish friend who was working with the Dutch Underground, a resistance movement that opposed the Nazis, and they found a temporary place for Maud and her younger sister to hide. Maud found herself with Jan Kanes and his 4 children. Jan's youngest child, Ingrid, would be born shortly after Maud's brief stay, but Ingrid grew up with the stories of the many Jewish people that her parents hid during the Holocaust, including Maud and her sister. On Sunday, January 28th, Maud and Ingrid are going to come together in the same room to share their recollections of this time period from these 2 very different vantage points. 2 young girls, one who was rescued and the other from a family of rescuers. They will share their memories and the impact of these experiences even 75 years later. This program is free to attend and will be held at the Museum of Flight. There's plenty of free parking. You will need to register ahead of time to attend, and there is a link in the chat, or you can find it on our website. As we watch the war between Israel and Hamas continue to unfold, the news becomes increasingly painful, and the responses from countries, politicians, universities, and even our friends and families becomes more complicated and sometimes more painful. In an effort to help us all meet the moment, our Holocaust Center is offering a series of presentations to help people navigate these difficult conversations. We have been holding sessions for teachers, and now we will be bringing them to general audiences. Starting in February with our next Lunch and Learn program, we will have navigating discussions about the Israel-Hamas conflict as a presentation. Registration and details will be on our website by tomorrow for this upcoming Lunch and Learn program. When we talk about the history of the Holocaust, we are generally referring to the destruction of the Jewish population in Europe between the years 1933 and 1945. In addition to the 6 million Jewish people killed in the Holocaust, there were millions of non-Jewish victims targeted by the Nazis. These groups included Jehovah's Witnesses, gay men, Afro-Germans, people with mental and physical disabilities, political opponents, and the Roma and Sinti population. Just as anti-Semitism was deeply rooted in European society prior to the Holocaust, so was social prejudice towards the Roma. The Nazis played upon existing social sentiment in order to justify the murder of between 250,000 and 500,000 Roma. But as the story of the Holocaust became widely known in the decades following the war, the genocide of Europe's Roma was largely excluded from the narrative. Not only was it not included, the persecution of the Roma persisted even decades after the Holocaust. In Reign of Ash, a new book by Ari Joskowicz, is the untold story of how Roma turned to Jewish institutions, funding sources, and professional networks as they sought to gain recognition and compensation for their wartime suffering. Here to tell us more about this relationship is author and Scari, Ari. He is a historian of European Jewry, and the Holocaust with a special interest in the complicated relations between different minority groups. He is the chair of the Department of Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt University, where he teaches on the Holocaust and the history of anti-Semitism. In his most recent book that I mentioned, Reign of Ash, Roma, Jews, and the Holocaust, his book won the Frankel Prize for the year's best book in Holocaust studies. He has held fellowships from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, among others. We will have time to take questions from the audience at the end of the program. Please type your questions in at any time into the Q&A. And Ari, it is such an honor to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for telling us more about the Roma experience.
My pleasure to be here.
Ari, I'm hoping that you can start us off by telling us a little bit more about the Roma population. I think most people in general are not familiar with Roma people and maybe know them just by some of the negative stereotypes that persist.
Right. So yeah, Roma are an incredibly diverse group of people. They have different religions. So Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, Orthodox Christians, very often the religion of their neighbors. They have different ways of life. And I think the one that many people will have on their mind will be an itinerant lifestyle that is traveling as a family, also as part of their occupation. And that is true for some Romani groups, was especially true in places like the UK, Western Europe, also groups that came to the United States early on. It is not necessarily true for the majority of Roma in Europe or the majority of Roma in the area where the Holocaust happened. So if we look at Central and Western Europe, many Roma were settled, had been settled for sometimes centuries, but certainly had been in the majority settled by the time of the Holocaust. So the image we have of people in with carriages, wagons, traveling around, I think that comes out of a particular geography, perhaps, and also particular visibility of these groups, but it is not the reality necessarily of the people we will describe. And now, when we talk about the Holocaust, they sometimes identify with a shared language, Romani. So, and I say identified with because many will speak that language, which has several varieties, but many also don't. For example, in Spain, Gitanos don't speak Romani. So all these elements, some people called it a super diversity. They're indeed profoundly diverse, I would say. That's also reflected in names, by the way. I will speak of Roma. That's the convention especially in American English. In British English, people also say Romanis. But the way that these groups might describe themselves might not fit that. And that's especially important for our topic because, well, the story of the Holocaust starts in Germany, and German Romanis will very often refer to themselves as Sinti. So I will also use that term just because it's also how they describe themselves. So they would say the Roma are in Eastern European Romanis, and they themselves would speak of themselves as Sinti. So I will sometimes speak of Sinti and Roma. But yeah, what I think what you can already see is that diversity is reflected also in lots of complexity of language.
And Ari, can you explain the term gypsy to us as well? I know that term is generally an undesirable term, but you were explaining to me yesterday when we were talking that, in fact, some groups prefer that term.
It's always complicated, right? I think the overall, if you speak in broad terms, you want to avoid that term, which is understood to be pejorative. But if you think locally, if you speak about very particular communities that are using that term for themselves, for example, in the UK, then that complicates it, and then that term makes a lot of sense. So the organization in the UK that is sort of a self-advocacy organization also has gypsies and travelers in the title of the organization. But as a sort of if as a scholar you speak, or, as somebody who cares, who speaks very broadly about the group, the understanding is that we avoid the term and stick to Roma. So the original organization that was actually sort of scholarly organization was called the Gypsy Lore Society. It still exists with that name, but it had a journal also called the Journal of the Gypsy Lore Society, and that has changed to Romani Studies, which shows you sort of where these shifts are happening in how we understand that they're terms that come mostly from the outside to define people, and then terms that people use for themselves more, and Rome. So which is why Roma is indeed preferred. But it is a diverse population. So and it's also I think we have this image of populations that are static. But if I speak of Roma in one point, that's the same people who you were talking about previously. It's a very dynamic situation where we also face nation building processes, I would say, where Roma are redefining who they are to some degree with new media and new ways of thinking about what makes them one Romani people. And as one Romani people, they are not just diverse, by the way. I should really mention that they are also a very large group. They are, by most counts, Europe's largest ethnic minority.
So, Ari, tell us a little bit about what inspired you to do the research that you did, and tell us a little bit about the book that you wrote.
Yeah. So I mean, this book really comes out of a moment, out of a situation of curiosity for me, a curiosity that just like the question you just asked me, that would have been a question I could not have answered, I think, 10 years ago with any certainty. What I did understand, like most scholars in this field, and most, if you asked most of the other visitors, scholars who have been given talks, and you were to ask them if they're supposed to know this, we would all say yes. This is our job. So I've been teaching the Holocaust for, what is it now, 15 years or more, and teaching the subject, coming out of a Jewish community in Austria, actually, where there was an understanding that we're both victims. There was some cooperation, but again, no understanding. So there's a sense of I'm supposed to know something here. I'm supposed to be able to communicate something, but then I just don't know. And the question for me was why I don't know, and what does all of this change for me when I start to ask these questions. Um, and well, one way to go about this is to just learn about Roma, indeed, and to learn about their Holocaust, which is one thing I did. But something I started to realize is that my own path here, as somebody, well, who's Jewish but also trained in Jewish history, um, that path from that place to trying to understand Roma is one that keeps repeating itself since 1945. That the very way we know about this this other genocide, the way it has been documented, the way it lies in our archives, the way we read these documents, the way we tell the stories in scholarship, but also in public, is closely connected to the relations that Jews and Roma actually had with each other. Because, well, the Jewish genocide is the much better known genocide. When we speak about that other genocide, we seem to do it through that lens. And we've been doing that for a long time. So for me, what this became a book about, yes, really rethinking the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, the Romani Holocaust, rethinking it through their relationship, rather than just thinking about one of them. So it became profoundly a book about relations.
You mentioned at one point, and I can't remember now if this was in your book or in an article, that you are the grandson of Holocaust survivors, and your grandparents would have thought this was strange that you were interested or researching the Roma experience. Can you tell me a
Yeah.
little bit more about that?
So this is from a preface I wrote to the book, and it's it's not just so this is in a way fictitious because I mean my grandparents are real. All four grandparents were Holocaust survivors, but I did not deal with this topic as long as they were alive. So I don't know exactly what they would have said about my interest. But I do know that they never spoke about Roma. And I know, even though they spoke about their experiences, because they're, you know, this, if you have four survivor grandparents, they speak to each other about their experiences, even if they're not trying to explain things to you, they speak to each other. Um, and they were in locations where there were Romani victims as well, I should say. But so all I know is they did not speak about it, and I know what people like them tended to think, and it's so one big part of the story that I tell is one of asymmetry, and what I mean by that word is that I mean various things, but as a starting point, it's really Jews didn't really have to think that much about Roma to explain what happened to them. My grandparents didn't really have. Nobody asked them what was that like the gypsies. That never ever came up. um, but for Roma, even when they started being interviewed, say for testimony archives, there that question was there immediately. Basically, if when they're explaining what happened to them, there's always that question. Was that is that sort of like what happened to the Jews? Um, so so um, so all of that made me understand that there's a good chance that my grandparents would have just not understood what my point is. Like who sort of um, at the same time, I should say my book is full of people who do care. And I do also start the actual introduction with somebody who cared very early on, one of the greatest poet perhaps of in Yiddish, the Yiddish poet of the Holocaust, Avram Sutzkever wrote an amazing poem about who will tell the story of the Romani genocide in 1946-47 already. And then the whole book is full of people who do care, but they care against the grain. They care when so many others don't. And both, and I do want to also, and the reason I started this with a personal, I should perhaps explain why I have a personal preface and why I think it's meaningful to speak in personal terms here. And that is because I think it's a difficult topic, because one can easily think of what I am saying as being about basically just competition and about it could be read as accusing survivors, Jewish survivors of something. And that is not what I wanted to do. And I wanted to make that clear to myself immediately that there is a human story that I want to tell. I understand why my grandparents, who were struggling on so many levels, did not care or had a hard time thinking of other stories. That is also not something one could expect. So what I wanted to do by writing that preface is to, from the very beginning, write stories of human beings who are who have very understandable limitations, um, and to in a way humanize a story that ultimately is also to a large degree about things that are much more less touchy-feely, if you want, that are very much about resources, the resources we have to tell our stories, the way archives work, the way courts of law work, the way compensation works, the many levels in which the world can be structurally unfair, if you want. Um, and I so that is so for me the personal here is something that I wanted to certainly give people who read my book or who hear me talk now, but it is really was something that was there to discipline myself, to never forget that I am dealing with human beings in writing a story of a relationship that was just, and we can go into that was very often very difficult. That was not just a relationship of two victims who understood each other as victims and always looked out for each other. It's sometimes a painful story, and for many decades was a painful story.
So, Ari, let me back up just a little bit and ask, here we have the genocide of another population, up to 500,000 Roma were murdered in the Holocaust. And yet it feels like the world is generally unfamiliar with stories of the Roma during this time period. What's the reason? What are some of the reasons for this?
So I think you already brought it up in your introduction to a large extent. The fundamental role here is played by its continuities in discrimination and continuities in criminalization of Roma. So Roma, when they were persecuted under Nazism, were persecuted by institutions that thought they were continuing work that had been done previously by their institutions, basically various forms of police forces, municipalities, etc., who had all believed before that already that they had to contain these populations, get rid of these populations, and then were basically just radicalizing what they were doing. And after the war, that many of these institutions thought, well, they're hampered now a bit in what they can do, but that they're still supposed to be pursuing those goals. That is, that Roma still needed to be surveyed, that they needed to be heavily policed, and that measures against Roma were basically measures against people called gypsies were generally understood to be legitimate security concerns. And in that context, it was very hard for the survivors to tell their stories. So the people who, in a way, and it's not just the authorities, this is about a whole society, including the other victims. And I should say Jewish victims in the beginning had challenges telling their own stories as well. The dominant groups that really controlled the sort of tools that the state gave society to recognize victimhood, those were in the hands of political victims or resistance fighters. And the image that they very often wanted to project was of heroic resistance, like la résistance. It is about there's both a heroic victim and a pure victim. Those are the images, and it meant that anybody with a criminal record would have to be basically not recognized as a victim. And many of the victim groups that we now see as obviously victims were seen as well persecuted for reasons that were not specific to the Nazis. That included homosexuals. There were very often the same criminal law paragraphs. Those laws were still on the books. There were no concentration camps for them, but the same laws were applied. So-called asocials, and people called gypsies were, so that there was basically a negotiation going on for them. Are they more like Jews, which they would argue they were, and thus racial persecutees, or were they more like these other groups who were persecuted for police reasons? So I think that continuing criminalization made it very hard for them to tell their story very often. And then second, there is a profound marginalization that they face. We don't just have to think about the Holocaust here. It's not just that they couldn't tell the story of their genocide. If you think of perhaps if you took whether it's a high school or college course on European history, or went to a museum that touches some national history in some European country, Roma will not come up. So even though, as I mentioned, they are the largest ethnic minority of Europe, their story is just absent. And it doesn't, and they're so marginalized that their absence doesn't even fully register. So in that sense, the reason we don't speak about them in the context of the Holocaust is very often, yeah, it's just a subset in a way of a much larger problem of ignoring their existence and ignoring their history.
So how, I would say the Jewish community has created a certain narrative about Holocaust history and how Jews experienced the Holocaust, even though it was in many different ways and there's many different perspectives. And I wonder, how do Roma describe or explain their own history and persecution by the Nazis?
So when we say explain, it's interesting. I think that's actually a very good term, because the image we very often have is that people just tell stories to themselves, and it's just a static story. But what happens with Jews, Roma, and everybody else is that it's a form of communication. So it depends very much on the context and who they're talking to. Um, there's actually very nice, colleagues did very nice research on Jews with this, with Jews who are living in who experienced one particular fate during the Holocaust, but then uh, you know, different survivors end up either in what was then the Soviet Union after the war, or Israel, or Canada, or the US. And depending where they end up, they frame what happened to themselves very differently. So I think there is that element. So over time, how Roma have described what happened to them has changed. Um, my impression is that, especially after 1989, as the what we just what if you want some sort of Western consensus story of what the Jewish Holocaust was, as that sort of became the expectation across the board as the Iron Curtain falls, that Roma broadly understood that they told their story very similar to the way Jews would tell their story about moments of persecution, about the dark days. Um, but I think the profound difference, there's several profound differences when it comes to telling the story. And it's who's listening. So Jews had to fight actually a long time, and this the story of the Holocaust as we have it now, right? The fact that there's somebody who would listen when you want to explain what happened during the Nazi years, that's not a given in the 50s, certainly in the 60s, not in the United States, not in Israel, not in well, not anywhere, I believe. Where people were expected to move on, where there were limited spaces to tell these stories, even if there was an awareness of what had globally happened. And then so Jews eventually come to a point where, yeah, that story is understood and they can communicate it with some self-assurance, not just so they can communicate it to their families, within a family, with some self-assurance, and also refer to larger social knowledge that they're applying here, right? This is my story of the Holocaust, right? So basically there's a general story, and then this is a survivor can speak about what they experienced in particular. When they speak to there were these large efforts to record interviews. First actually within families, but then these big archives started to record interviews for volunteers. And I think Jews very much understood that these are people who are on their side. So they're people, right? They're calling you. They say, "We would love to hear your story. Can we record you?" And they understand, well, these are, I will just tell the story the way I want to tell it. And then, I mean, it's very structured sometimes, the interview, but ultimately it's my story. And for Roma, that was not as obvious. The people who had previously knocked on their door to ask them about their stories, so that to get that their Roma story, um, had not been that benevolent. The Nazi regime had played with that itself in its persecution, sort of claiming they're experts who are trying to just do genealogical research, and then ended up using that to get them deported. Um, when they were highly policed communities very often. Speaking to prosecutors was a strange act, because the same criminal, they were usually interviewed for criminal police headquarters to speak in trials against Nazi criminals. Those are the same police headquarters that were instrumental for getting them deported to begin with, and that are still surveilling them. No such thing existed for Jews. So when Roma were telling their story, they told it as a community that is under pressure, that is much more defensive in how it can tell its story. So So I don't think there is a single answer to how they speak about their narrative. I think the one broad thing I would say is that the continuities again are crucial. I think a Jewish story tends to be, before this we had rights, you know, it was anti-Semitism was rising or not, but it was we had a life. Then came the Nazis. We were completely, you know, we lost everything. Lives were destroyed. Then came liberation, which again we know is a complicated moment for many people. But then comes liberation, and then comes a period when you have equal rights again. That's not true for Roma. So many Roma would can tell stories of being highly policed before. They had special identity papers that they had to get stamped in many countries whenever they moved within the country, basically an internal passport with fingerprints. In some places, so France is an excellent example here. In some places, they were released before liberation, in fact, in many French camps. In other French camps, they were kept after liberation until 1946. So France was largely liberated by the fall of 1944. There were Roma who remained in camps, in the same camp, until 1946, because the authorities said, this is just our charge. This has nothing to do with Nazism. This is just something we do to secure this area. So you get very different continuities. The same IDs were sometimes used into the 1960s, from the 1930s to the 1960s. So you have an experience that Jews just don't have. It makes it less neat in a way, where the story begins and where it ends. So the traditional testimonies of Jews really focus on the war. It's basically, when did the Nazis come? And it ends with when you were liberated, and then you give a bit of a view of what happened to you afterwards. But there's an understanding that it's such a very clearly bound period when that persecution happened. There's just an understanding that, you know, there won't be a so-called Jew expert in the police in the 1960s. That's not even a term, right? But various police forces, including in the United States and in Germany in the 1960s, had a gypsy expert, whom the first historians who wanted to hear these people's stories, they would go to the local police so-called gypsy expert and ask them for the addresses of Roma. So all of this really changes how the story is told, I would say.
So in your book, you encourage us to look at the shared histories and the shared experiences of Jews and Roma through a lens of connection rather than comparisons. And I think this is a really interesting approach. And can you tell us more about that, and also tell us how and where these communities would intersect and maybe do intersect?
Yeah. So comparison is something very, very interesting, because there are whole debates among scholars and somewhat in public about who can compare, what can you compare. And to some degree, people always compare. And the people who started comparing were not those who looked at the event after the fact, but the victims themselves. When Jews or when Roma are trying to assess where they're at in terms of their fate, they're looking across either a real or metaphorical barbed wire fence and are trying to figure out, basically, what is my relationship to the other enemies of this regime? Can I gauge what is happening to me? So comparison is always there, I would say, to some degree. But comparison also has some problems. Very often when we think of why stories of Jews and Roma are told differently, I think people go fairly quickly to comparison. And the thing about comparison is that, so we can be very empirical about comparisons, and you know, scholars think highly of their own empiricism and how strict they are. And you can ask, well, how many people died here and how many people died there? You can ask about intentions, etc. But one thing we can't do simply empirically is ask, why are we actually using a particular standard of comparison? And which standard you use changes everything. Just one, just a very small example. I'm originally from Austria, where approximately somewhere around 60,000 Jews and 8,000 Roma died. And if I say it like that, you can see the dimensions. It seems fairly asymmetrical in one direction. But then if I tell you, well, that means that 1/3 of the Jews, but 2/3 of Roma died, it completely changes how you view it again. And there is no objective standard if we go by percentages or overall numbers. And number two, even when I speak about it in those terms, you can immediately sense how callous it is, how odd it is to start thinking about mass death and suffering in those terms. So for that reason, also because there's a bad history of people comparing mainly to show that Roma did not suffer like Jews, and the people who started this are courts that didn't want to pay reparations and compensation payments to Roma, who basically, went sort of line by line. Did you experience exactly this that we know from Jews? Did you experience exactly that? And when it didn't apply, they said, well, then it doesn't count, and you shouldn't get any compensation. So there's a bad history of why comparisons are done. So for all these reasons, I became quite skeptical of comparison as an act in itself. And what I tried to replace it with is actual humans interacting with each other. And when you do that, you realize not that precisely what I said about there are no empirical reasons for why we use one standard of comparison rather than another. You realize there are very human reasons for why people are framing things in certain ways. So for me, this was really a way of not just telling human stories, but really rethinking the assumptions that go into the way we tell the stories. And I feel that's what relational history can really do. It really, the comparison comes very easily to us, and there's a bit of a sort of a common sense way we go about it very often. But this is where I feel it gets, history can really give us something when you start to really ask why we are speaking in those terms. When did we start to speak in those terms? What are the assumptions that went into it? You get that by looking precisely at the relations between real people who are interacting with each other. So and so that became sort of very central for me.
So in looking at how these two groups have maybe come to work together and how their stories have a little bit become intertwined, but maybe the Roma story more dependent on Jewish Holocaust history and how these stories are told. I see in those relationships both kind of a cooperativeness and also some competition in a way. And I want to specifically reference the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum because they're our nation's largest Holocaust institution. Yeah. And there was some controversy about including the Roma as part of the museum's narrative. Can you tell us why was this controversial? And did this same controversy exist with including other groups that were targeted by the Nazis?
Yeah, so yes, I think this very much happened in a context where inclusion in this museum was generally a question. And actually, we have a very really fascinating image here. This is actually a protest that happened in 1986 in Washington, D.C., in front of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, which is the governing body that still exists, that would build the museum that would be built in 1993, that would open in 1993. And the chairman of that committee was Elie Wiesel, which is why you can see on this this poster here, we ask Wiesel, why no Gypsy representatives? Racism betrays ideal of Holocaust Memorial Council. So this was a protest. These were sort of improvised, right, concentration camp uniforms that they used to draw attention to their concerns. So this happens. So the museum itself is founded. Perhaps one has to really just step back a few years for why these conflicts take the form they do. So first of all, I want us to remember again the story of the Jewish Holocaust as we tell it itself was a struggle. It was a struggle to tell that story for Jewish survivors to really be able to communicate that they had a unique experience that is not just the experience of war. That this is not just about people dying and that's sad. No, there was a specific type of persecution, genocide, which is also a new term from the 1944, but basically from the post-war period in legal contexts. So there was a unique thing that happened to them, and that when we think about Nazism, yes, we can think about authoritarianism, but really what makes that regime unique was that genocide. And the moment when this really becomes present for many Americans is in 1978, when NBC has a 3-part miniseries with the title Holocaust. That brings it right into people's living room, and now it becomes something you can refer to. If you have one name, it's a capitalized word, and you can say, this person was in the Holocaust, and you know what's meant. You can at this point. So 1979, there are always there are always political reasons for anything happens in Washington. It has to do with President Carter sending fighter planes to Saudi Arabia and wanting to make amends. He ends up with a commission. After this NBC miniseries, and it's at this point that there's a commission that recommends there should be a memorial, but that memorial should actually be a museum. This is how the museum comes into, which is why there's a memorial museum. It's a memorial that is also a museum. With that, you get a unique situation. You have a memorial that at this point is it's a museum. It will become an archive as well, actually, but at this point is envisioned mainly as a museum. On the Mall in the United States, in Washington, D.C., the big representative space of the nation, about an event that happens somewhere else. And the question is, well, the reason it's there is also because the U.S. has a glorious role to play here. It's liberation. It ends the event. But then the question is, well, who should be included? And it's not just the groups you mentioned now, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. It's Poles, Ukrainians, and Ukrainian sort of exile organizations, right? Diaspora organizations that say, we were victims too. So what the council does face is basically very difficult policy decisions and very difficult explanations for why in a multicultural nation, on the one hand, you want to explain the Holocaust to, and this is very much their understanding, a multicultural nation. You want to communicate it to everybody, a diverse society, but at the same time, this should just be the Jewish story. So in a way, Roma are a casualty of these larger debates. But I think that's also only I think that's part of it. And it's so what is helpful here is just to understand many of the people on that council understood that Jews finally were able to tell their story, and that it was too early to tell more of that story, and that if you open the dam, who knows what will happen. They were willing to actually include them in some ways, but never on the terms that were equal. It was understood as a Jewish museum that let in others. And this is and ended up also being a story of resources. And among other things, so the museum actually has a very strange funding structure. It comes out of the Carter years, but it's a very Reagan era policy, which is it's a federal institution, but all the money has to come from donations for the building, and eventually a lot of the activities as well are funded actually by donations. So it's a mix of political institution, a government institution, and a donor-based institution that relies to a large degree on Jews who identify with this institution. It has to, right? It's survivors, it's their family members, who need to identify with the institution. And Roma found very little space there. Even when they were led on to those councils, for example, it was pretty clear that what they could contribute was not what the museum cared about, which was, among other things, help with fundraising. Um, um, so all of this made the museum very, very explosive as a place. And I think the 80s and 90s are full of these conflicts. It's not just the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. There's so many conflicts where there's sort of a real breakthrough in the memorial culture. And Germany in the 1990s, there's the decision to build a central monument in Berlin, for example, for the murdered Jews of Europe. And it's this very large monument by artist Peter Eisenman. It's sort of in the middle of Berlin. It's extremely visible. And as it was being developed, there was a question, well, should other groups be included in that? And the Jewish community said no. And eventually now there's a separate monument for Roma and Sinti. But these were very, very, really bruising conflicts where precisely that question of what does it mean that there are two victim groups, and what is an adequate way of bringing together the stories that nevertheless respects each story, that was negotiated in a way that was, well, that was hurtful, and particularly hurtful for the Romani activists of the time, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely see there's a sense, I mean, as you said, maybe there's a feeling of limited resources, but there is kind of an underlying sense of competition, maybe also for
Yeah. And I do think it changed.
acknowledgement.
I do think I should add, really, for all of this, I do think there is there is a generational change. I don't think these things go away. So I think they're basically right there. There are many more Jewish institutions or institutions here to commemorate the Jewish Holocaust than there are to commemorate the Romani Holocaust, right? When I speak about this book, I tend to speak at institutions like this one, right, that is dedicated to remembering the genocide, the Nazi genocide of Jews. And that doesn't just go away, right? It's also not just goodwill. I mean, that just makes it go away. But at the same time, what really changed over the 70 years since the end of the war is how that conversation about these asymmetries takes place. So right after the war, the people who were really trying to include Roma were basically talking to other Jews about what happened to the Roma. Then a generation later, you get people who start to talk to Roma, individual Romani survivors, but from a very Jewish perspective. Then you get individual Jewish and Romani activists sort of interacting with each other, but the Jewish institutions are still very, very prominent. And eventually you get to the point where I think we're at now, where you have Romani institutions as well, where you don't have full equity, but what you have is a conversation between where also the many of this younger generation have fairly similar biographies in how they get into scholarship, how they get into activism, and how they come to these themes. They're very similar heritage tourism trips now that bring Jews and Roma to places like Auschwitz, whether it's the March of the Living, and there's a similar event also that for on August 2nd every year that brings Romani youth to Auschwitz. So they have much more similar biographies. There's much more conversations that happen on an equal plane to some degree, or speaking on an equal plane about the unequal plane, I would say. And then finally, I mean, we can get to that too. I mean, what I think ultimately is really changing. What's changing so much for Jewish institutions is something you mentioned in your introduction about your programming, which is the politics of Israel. And technically, they have nothing to do with Roma, but precisely because of that, these relations are changing. So in the 1980s and 1990s, I think you have real competition over these issues, and it's a central issue. But if you look at the past 20 years, and that was to some degree already true in the 1990s, but it sort of becomes more radicalized, is really the breakdown of a lot of alliances that Jewish institutions manage to have with other groups. And then I work on a campus, right? It's where famously these things are coming to a head. And it's happening also across Europe. And it's not that there is any that I don't want to think of anything of homogeneous blocks of people or any such thing. But at the same time, it's just so obvious that if somebody in a conversation brings up Israel, Palestine, Gaza, right? Everybody basically, has full attention there, is wondering what's going to happen next, and it can really, it will end a conversation like nothing else, pretty much. And that because of that, the relations with Roma are now actually much simpler. I think in a way they didn't change, but what changed is the alternatives. I think there's an understanding among many organizations that you need to be inclusive, and this is a way of being inclusive that is much less threatening than if you were to start talking about racism more broadly.
I
Or
wonder, I want to get to the questions. We have a number of questions from the
yeah,
audience coming in, but I want to ask you about that because you said it makes the relations simpler, but I would think that it would make it even more complicated because what we're seeing with the Israel-Hamas war is that there's much more division, I think, maybe than people expected, or new divisions are being created politically, ethnically, racially, and I just wonder if that creates more tension.
I think it's about relative tension. So I also I don't know exactly what the immediate war is doing. I've been asking many colleagues and people about what it really does at this very moment, and I'm not completely sure. Historically, it goes back to the way people tell their story, actually. So one thing, there's several things that the relations between Jews and Roma did in the way people tell their stories. And one thing it did for Roma is it changed their imaginary of what's possible. So say when Israel abducts Adolf Eichmann and puts him on trial, this is a moment that is absolutely fascinating for many Roma. This is right, it's a model of the victims are allowed to sit in judgment over their killer, basically. And it inspires them. It's around this time that various Romani organizations, as they're trying to think about who are the Roma, who are we, how can we think of ourselves in nation-like ways, they use Zionism as a model. It's not a specific Zionism, it's not labor Zionism, it's not there's no details there, but it is and it's sometimes religiously inspired actually as well, sort of evangelically, religiously inspired. But it is so there's something that is inspiring here about Jewish politics, about Jews' ability to get some sort of justice for what happened to them, and even that model. I mean, ultimately the Romani political movements decide that a territorial solution is not anything they're seeking. It's a virtual Romanistan. But there were people who had imagined a Romani state actually, with Israel as the model. So what remains from that is some way. So especially the older generation, which is in a way sometimes quite so both aware of these bruising conflicts and philo-Semitic and very friendly to the politics of Israel, identifies with it. A younger generation that is more skeptical, but at the same time, a Romani political field, a political movement that is also very aware that you just have to get, that it's intergenerational, that this is a diverse group, and that the politics of Israel if you make them really central, you're going to break a lot of things. So
So,
they haven't become. So as far as I can tell, Israel is not as central remains not as central, was certainly not, but even remains not as central for Romani politics. And that does make it safer. It's also in the past, right? And in a way, if you speak about other genocides, um, um, you can very quickly have somebody raise their hand, right, and say how about, and it's just a bit less likely in a way in a commemorative ceremony that says no, we both victims died here. Say you're at a ceremony in a concentration camp. It's much easier to imagine that now, and as not being deeply troubling. This stuff is not gonna, if you're a representative of a Jewish organization, no matter what your opinion is, actually, you can be, left, right, whatever it is, this is not going to keep you up. It's
so
comfortable, uncomfortable. Whereas Israel, but you never know if you organize an event these days, if not, and again, irrespective of your own position, if there won't be people, screaming others down and disrupting everything, etc. So I think in that sense, it's become a safer space. At least that's one of my arguments
mhm.
that I would hold. Yeah.
So Ari, I want to ask you a couple questions, two questions in particular from the audience just before we run out of time here. One of them comes from Stuart, and he asks, did the Romanis get compensation from Germany after the war? And we just have a couple minutes, so we just have to
Yes. I'll try to make it
be
short.
mindful of the time.
Yes. There were massive conflicts around this. So I would say they received inadequate compensation. There were challenges to having them accepted as victims of racial persecution per definition. So they could individually sometimes prove it, but very early on, there were challenges to just having it be an easier process. And ultimately, compensation doesn't just rely on simply what the state, not simply rules, but your ability to access it. If you've ever filled out any form, and an insurance form or anything, you know that you want help, and that you're dealing with a big bureaucracy. So these are very complicated processes. Jews had organizations on their side, like the United Restitution Organization, were legal aid societies, basically, that helped them fill these out. Where Roma did not, and when Roma did not have that support, even where the rules were more positive, they often face much more difficult situations. So they might not even know when the deadlines are, etc., to submit their applications.
And this is the last question. There's another one here. And thank you to everybody, by the way, who submitted questions. Some of them I think we got to, and if we didn't, I apologize. We will try to reach them separately. But here's our last question that comes in. And this person writes, there's no doubt that the Roma Sinti suffered terribly. I'm interested in when the Nazi regime became interested in the Roma. For example, was there a Wannsee-like conference? And this is not meant to minimize their suffering, because my experience of Roma persecution was occasionally mentioned in my family.
Oh, very interesting. So this is a really hard one to answer in a very short period. I'll do my best. Right, so we now understand that even the persecution of Jews is right. So there used to be two positions called intentionalists and functionalists. So people who thought there's a blueprint that just has to be so intentional. There was a blueprint. The Nazis were just waiting for the moment. And functionalists who would argue that there is a iterative process, basically, of experimentation, and leads from, yes, antisemitism, but ultimately you get to a point where there is where you have genocide. So I would say what we're seeing with Roma is indeed there's a different type of interest, I would say. So I think it does have a different dynamic. For the Jews are a central point for the regime, basically. It's absolutely central in how they define their own raison d'être, their reason to be. right? The fight against Jews, against hidden Jewish powers in whatever form they have, both Western and Eastern, so communist and capitalist, both forms. That defines Nazism, in a way that it doesn't for Roma. What happens with Roma is indeed, I think, a persecution that comes much more through the executive branch, is often bottom up, and nevertheless congeals eventually to become genocidal as well. So I think, I'll give a very short answer here. I think it's what makes it so essential, actually, to think about them together, because both are models for how genocide happens. And if you only focus on one, you're actually missing a lot of what we think of as those political science-y lessons of the Holocaust, like how do we avoid it? Because one model indeed is the regime obsesses about a group, and then when certain conditions are met, ends up actually committing genocide. And the other is that there is a consistent way that over-policed communities that are targeted in ways that are much more local, and that ultimately, out of this sort of over-policing, again, under very particular conditions, you can also get to moments of genocide. So I think they're different. There were conferences where people did discuss murdering Roma, but it's still not quite the same equivalent. It's also, there are different institutions within RSHA, the central security authority within in the Nazi, in the Third Reich, different departments that are responsible for Roma and for Jews. Ultimately, also, I should mention very briefly, it's also a history of regimes that are allied with Germany. So the Romani Holocaust really cannot be told without the actions of the Ustasha regime, so independent Croatia, and Romania. Those are very large players. So the Jasenovac camp in Croatia, Transnistria, this area in the Ukraine that is occupied by Romania, which has various camps where 25,000 Roma are deported from Romania. Those are essential parts of the story. So in a way, we also, much like actually for the murder of Jews, but perhaps in its dimensions even more, we cannot tell the story of the murder of Europe's Roma simply by looking only at Nazi Germany, but need to look at the dynamics of the regimes that are sometimes completely dependent on Nazi Germany or its allies.
Ari, I want to thank you so much. I mean, I have learned a tremendous deal from your research, and I'm so grateful that you have done this deep dive into this to help shed some light on the Romani experience and how these communities have worked together, and just how we can continue to think about how the Holocaust is represented in our education and our research. Thank you so much for all that you're doing and for being with us today to help us to better understand it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to thank everybody who attended today for today's program to kick off our 2024. Thank you again to Ari, and thank you to our entire staff who are working so hard to carry out the Holocaust Center's work and our mission, especially to Richard Green, our technology director, who is running this program behind the scenes, and also Dee Simon, our CEO, and our entire team, Paul Regelbrug, Jessica Michaels, Branda Anderson, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Morgan Romero, Lexi Jason, Amanda Davis, Katie Lawrence, Michael Langberg, Olivia Teague, Mario Felipe Belmonte, and our newest member, Lisa Spink. Wishing you all a good afternoon and safety and security in the weeks to come. Thank you for joining today's program, and we hope to see many of you on January 28th. This concludes our program for today.